One of those things where you start it and then there's no going back. I've done that too. On Wednesday nights, Andy has been teaching Romans, and I know not all of you get to be in Andy's Romans class, but it's an excellent, excellent class. And man, he's not even here for me to hear me say that, is he? He's taking care of the little one. Well, you can tell Andy I was complimentary of his class. But over the last few weeks, I've been thinking about this idea or this sermon passing through my head, and thought, well, this would be a great opportunity to bring a lesson out of Romans. Not that you know how preachers, we look at the same passage and we get different ideas from it. But tonight we're going to look at Romans chapter 3 rather quickly, but in a special way. As we put it into its context, remember Romans, Paul is writing about the relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles. They're having a lot of difficulties, especially the Jews, in accepting the Gentiles. In fact, many of the Jews thought that being a Gentile and obeying the same gospel and doing the very same thing that any Jew would have to do in order to become a Christian was a travesty against them. As they saw it, they had been living under the auspices of God and the law and trying to walk that narrow path to the best of their ability, or to the best of the oversight of the Pharisees, we would say. And they were striving each and every day under the oppressive thumb of the Pharisees. And they thought it's just not fair if right after the cross, a Gentile can do exactly the same thing that I do, when they have not had to live under the same constraints of the law. They have not had to live under the watchful eye of the Jewish leadership. It's not fair. They should first have to become Jews, proselytize to the Jewish religion, and then embrace Christianity. To them, that was the only reasonable way to do it. But God did not put it up or set it up so that the Gentiles would first become Jews. In fact, the Jewish nation had a specific purpose. It was, in fact, to bring us unto the Messiah. It was the schoolmaster. That law was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ himself. Once Christ was here, the law was completed. It was fulfilled. It was done away with. And so there was no need to say, well, you first got to become a Jew under the law and then a Christian. That was an extra step that was put in there. One man said it this way: God did not design a salvation plan that got to Calvary through Sinai. Well, and what they mean by that is the Gentile nation did not have to come through the law of Sinai to get to the grace of Calvary. Once Calvary had been established and the church was in swing, anyone, regardless of where they lived, regardless if they were or what gender they were, or how much money they had, or how much education they had, none of those things mattered. If they loved God and obeyed in faith, they would have been added to His church. That was the promise from the very beginning. The Jews, not liking this idea, were looking at the unrighteousness of the Gentiles and how far away they have lived from God. After all, under the law, the precepts of the law drew them closer to God. The Gentiles, in their own unrighteousness and immoral ways, lived in a much further distance from God, and so they weren't close enough to find grace. Paul writes Romans, and he says, look, I'm not ashamed to preach the gospel, for therein is the power of God unto salvation. And so immediately he introduces in Romans 1 verse 16 that there is a common salvation to everyone, because it all comes through the gospel. Then in the latter part of chapter 1, he starts talking about how many of them had disregarded God. They had put Him out of their mind. They had rejected the very concept of God for their lives, and therefore they embraced in all kinds of immorality. Sinful debauchery that was so rank that it had God turning His nose up at them, as the Jew would say. And you can just hear the Jews as they're reading the opening chapter of Romans. Yeah, Paul, you get after them. Paul, you tell them how bad they were. Paul, you show them just exactly where they are in reference to God. They're so far away, they will never see Him. And then Romans chapter 2, Paul says, and what advantage do you have, O man of God, who desire to be saved by the law? Wait a minute, Paul, what are you saying? Are you saying there's no advantage? Paul, are you saying that I, as a Jew, am in the same boat as the Gentile? And that's exactly what he's saying. So he spends all of chapter 2 saying, look, as bad as the Gentiles were, you Jews were just as bad or worse, because you're doing the very same thing that they're doing, except you think you're saved because you live under the Jewish law. So Paul wraps it up in this neat little bow that we call chapter 3. He says, you Jews, you Gentiles, you whoever you may be, we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Every one of us. Now, to prove that, Paul has a sermon within this chapter in which he actually goes back to some of the Old Testament passages to show that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It's not just that the Gentiles are bad or just that the Jews are bad, but that everyone is bad. So in verse 9 he says, what then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Gentile. Paul, so we've already made this charge. We've already made this indictment against everyone. Jew and Gentile. There's no difference in them. Jew and Gentile are under sin, as it is written. And he starts with a quote from Psalm 14, verses 1 through 3. When he says, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good. Psalm 14 begins with the phrase that Paul does not actually quote here. But it begins, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The foolish person looks at this world and all of the creation, and he says, I could do it in my sleep. He looks at everything around him and he says, surely there is no God. He identifies what he perceives as evil in this world, and he says, in a world that is so tainted with evil, surely there is no God. In a world that seems devoid of supernatural power, he says, surely there is no God. And God calls that man a fool. But what happens when you say there is no God? What is the foolish life? The rest of the psalm continues, none is righteous, no, not one. When you take God out of the picture, unrighteousness, wickedness, and sinfulness reign. Brethren, we are in a battle today. A battle for the hearts and minds of mankind. We are fighting with the devil and his minions, trying to convince people that there is a God. And that if there is a God, there is a way to live and a way to respond to that God. And each of us, whether we call ourselves Christian or whether someone calls themselves by another religious name, it makes no difference. Each of us is still under obligation to follow the one true God. Paul says, there is none righteous because they do not believe in God, or they do not practice a life under God. We've mentioned the phrase before, but practical atheism. The practical atheist is the one who will tell you all day long that there's a God and they believe and trust in Him as God. But in their practice, they act like there's no God. There's no right way to live. There's no obligation to follow. We do whatever we want to do. That's practical atheism. And whether he comes out and says there is no God, or he just lives his life like there is no God, it means that they are not going to be righteous. Now, this battle that we're in, we're trying to convince people not only that there's a God, but that He moves in this world. There is supernatural power all around us. There is something higher than man outside of the realm of what we can see or what we can lay our hands upon or what we can touch. It is outside of our empirical senses. It is beyond the natural world. And it is tainting not only our everyday lives, it is tainting our educational system, it is tainting our political system, it is tainting our economic system. Everything is touched by whether or not they believe there is a God or there is not a God. And when they say there is no God, there is no one righteous, no, not a single one, and there's no hope for that to change. That's the reality of what Paul is talking about in Romans 3. There is none that understands. When Jesus said, you shall love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. We're talking about the whole man. Right? In Mark chapter 12 and verse 30. That's the whole man. The mind is the intellect. It's what he thinks. The heart is the seat of his emotions toward God. The strength is his physical body. These are the things that we love God with. We put everything that we have into loving God. Now notice where he starts here in verse 10. He says, not only is there none righteous, the reason why is because there's no one that understands. Understanding has to do with the mind. And their mind had been corrupted. It was corrupted by the fact that they said there was no God. In chapter 1 with the Gentiles, they put themselves in the place of God, and therefore their mind is corrupted. And in this corrupt mind, there is no one that will turn to God and say, I'm going to follow Him. Because they don't believe there is a God and their mind has been corrupted. Number 2, he says there is no one that seeks for God. Do you know what we search for? We search for the things that our heart desires. You think about the man who finds the pearl of great price. It's the one thing that he's been searching for all of his life. And he buys that pearl of great price. Why? Because that's what his heart was seeking. When Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6 that we are to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven, because where your heart is, or where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The second issue here is not a mind problem, but a heart problem. Deep inside of us, we recognize that our desire is either for God and heaven or things of this earth. Jesus, or Paul says in Colossians 2 or 3 in verse 1 that we are to set our affections on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. He is the object of our affection. But if we're not seeking after God, that's a heart problem. Well, what are we seeking after then? I've always believed that our heart is going to be filled with love and desire for something. And we get to choose what that's going to be. We get to choose if that's going to be God. We get to choose if that's going to be money. We get to choose if that's going to be unrighteousness and wicked and worldly vice. We choose what we're going to fill our hearts with. That's why Jesus said, set your affections above, or set your treasures above. It's because He knows that we have a choice about where we set our hearts. The heart problem is they weren't seeking after God. And then He says that we've all gone astray. We've turned aside. We have become worthless because no one does good. My mind is blocking God out. My heart is not seeking Him. And my will, or the direction of my life, does not follow the good path. That's what it comes down to. So, out of Psalm 14, Paul is telling us that we've got a mind problem, a heart problem, and a will problem. And we've got to change that. In Isaiah 1, verse 6, it says, from the top of the head, or from the bottom of the feet to the top of the head, there is no soundness in it. Talking about the nation. And how much sin had abused them and mutilated them. He says they are full of bruises and raw wounds. And they will not let me soften them with oil or press them out. The nation of Israel had fended God off. And we found that there was no soundness, no health from the bottom of their feet to the top of their head. You ever felt that way? You slept at an odd angle during the night and you wake up in the morning, your back hurts and your hip hurts and your shoulder's out of a line. And you feel like there's not one spot on me that doesn't hurt. Maybe you don't feel that way. Maybe you hadn't played racquetball in years and you go out on the court with Russell and he beats the tar out of you. And the next day you wake up and everything hurts, including the lip where you hit yourself with a racket. Not that that ever happened. Not that that ever happened. And you feel like there's no soundness in it. Everything hurts. So we give ourselves a once-over, right? We check our head, we check our nose, we check our mouths, we check our joints. We stretch and we bend and we pull and we try to get it all worked out so that we feel right. Give ourselves a once-over, as it were. Notice what Paul does in the next few verses. He gives us a spiritual checkup, a once-over, from the bottom of the feet to the top of the head. Just like they were unsound in Isaiah's day, he says, look, there was a problem. The problem is that we as Jews, we as humanity, have engaged in this spiritual defamation of our own character. We have turned aside, and we have become worthless and unprofitable, in verse 12. I always think, when I read that, I always think of Luke chapter 15, the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son and the lost coin and the lost sheep. Do you realize that when the sheep was lost, as long as he was lost, he was worthless? You can't eat a lost sheep. You can't harvest his wool. And the coin, as long as the coin was lost, it didn't matter if it was worth $100 or a penny. It was worthless as long as it was lost, because you can't spend lost money. And the son to the father, as long as he is away, he was lost and was worthless to the father. But when he came back, there was profit. When the coin was found, it was spendable. When the sheep was brought back, it was usable. He says, we have all turned aside and have become unprofitable. Now notice verse 13. He starts with an oral exam. An oral exam, because our mouth tends to be the thing that gets us in trouble most. I don't know if it's because we don't follow James's advice, that we are slow to speak, slow to anger, swift to hear, but slow to speak and slow to anger. I don't know if it's because of that, if it's because we live in a society that is easily offended. I don't know if it's because we have lost the ability to explain and communicate in a large way. But for whatever reason, the mouth has always been one of the hardest things to control. In James chapter 3, he says, if a man is able to bridle the tongue, he is a perfect man. He's perfect. Paul writes here in verse 13, their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. The first verse is from Psalm 5 and verse 9. Paul puts this in here to show that the man's speech patterns can destroy him. The venom of an asp is under his lips. Everything he speaks can be poison. The mouth is full of curses and bitterness. And you see this connected synonymous words here. Throat, tongue, lips, mouth. They all are in reference to the speech of mankind. I've already mentioned James chapter 3, but think about Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 34, he says, verse 30, whoever is not with me is against me. No. Yeah, verse 34. I had it right the first time. You brood of vipers, how can you seek or speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. From within the heart, that's what we speak. Verse 35, the good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. James talks about the water. A fountain or a spring doesn't send forth sweet water and bitter water at the same time. We have to watch and control our tongue. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, Colossians 4 and verse 6. We need to do an oral checkup sometimes and make sure that our words are edifying and uplifting and encouraging to other people. as opposed to tearing them down and insulting. But it's not just an oral exam. Verse 15, he goes into podiatry, an orthopedic exam. Check your feet. Notice, their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. This from Isaiah 59, verses 7 and 8. The feet were indicative of motion, of movement, of the ability to get up and go from one place to another place. The feet were also indicative of speed, not just moving, but speed and get to another place. That's why Paul uses in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 15, saying that we have our feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. We put the gospel on our feet so that we can go into the world and preach the gospel unto every living creature. We've got to make sure that our feet are going to the right place. When we say to the little children in Bible class, "Oh, be careful, little feet, where you go." Don't allow them to take us into the world, deeper into sin or away from God. Don't allow them to take us to places where temptations will overwhelm us. Be careful, little feet, where you go. He says their feet are swift to shed blood. The idea of murder. They go out and they murder and they maim one another. In their paths, what walks on the path but the feet? In their paths are ruin and misery. And the way of peace they have not known. Peace comes when I accept the peace that comes from God that passes all understanding in Philippians 4. That peace which passes understanding will guard our hearts and minds, which we'll use that in just a moment too. But that way of peace they did not know. In fact, we go back to Matthew 7. Jesus says there's two roads. There's a broad one that leads to eternal destruction, and there's the narrow one that leads to eternal life. The narrow one is the way of peace. But he says here, these people did not know that way. They only knew the way of death, destruction, and misery. We need to have an orthopedic exam. Make sure that our feet are going in the right direction and following the right path. And then finally, he goes back to the heart. Cardiac examination. How strong is your heart, and is it pumping in the right direction? Notice verse 18. He says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. You remember what he said? He began, there's none righteous, no, not one. No one understands. Do you want to know why no one understands? Solomon tells us in Proverbs 1 and verse 7 that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. He says here the problem with the heart is they don't fear God. And when you don't fear God, you cannot begin to understand the ways of God. Their ignorance is based upon a heart problem. They have gone into a cardiac arrest. There is no fear of God before their eyes. They do not witness His power. They do not witness His creation. They simply do not believe God has that power. And so their heart doesn't fear. They have that heart problem. There's a lot of heart problems in the Bible. Things like selfishness, that's a heart problem. Well, I'm only thinking about myself and myself first. Materialism is a heart problem because I've set my affections on things of this earth, the material wealth around me. There's another heart problem, superficial Christianity, where we change the outside, but the inside remains untouched. Jesus in Matthew 6 and verse 24 talks about a divided heart, one that loves both God and the world. He says you simply cannot do that. Another heart problem we see often in the church is a distracted heart, one that has a little over here and a little over there and a little over there and a little over there, and nothing has come to fruition. The Bible refers to them as busybody, people who are working around and always working and never getting anything done. You see, the problem is when our heart does not fear God, our heart will not lead us in the right place. We need to have a heart exam. About the time we're having that foot exam. At the same time we're having the oral exam. And we need to make sure that our entire body, instead of being like those of Isaiah 1, it says, from the sole of their feet to the top of their head, there is nothing healthy in them. That's sinners. That's people of this world. That's who we were. And let us close with Psalm 17. Because it's the same checkup. Only it's the other direction. Hear a just cause, O Lord, and attend to my cry. Give ear to my prayer from my lips, free of deceit. There's the mouth. Listen. From your presence, let my vindication come. Let your eyes behold the right. You have tried my heart. You have visited me by night. You have tested me, and you will find nothing. I have a purpose that my mouth will not transgress. With regard to the works of man, by the word of your lips, I have avoided the ways of the violent. My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped. You see, we have the opportunity to have a sound heart, a sound mouth, and a sound feet. The problem that Paul is pointing out is without Christ, we are all sinners. There is no sound heart, there are no good feet, and the words are not right before God. And the only thing that can change that is the blood of Christ. That's Paul's whole point in the book of Romans, is that despite the disputes that you've had, we're all sinners, but we're all saved in the same way, by hearing the gospel, obeying it, being baptized for the remission of our sins. And it's the same today. So if you've been sitting here and you said, I've done an oral exam, you know what, I've struggled with my tongue. I know that I've said words that were unkind. I've showed malice and hatred toward others, and I need to repent of my sins. Then you can do that tonight. Maybe you've been doing a foot check, and you found that your feet haven't gone to the right places. They're not carrying the gospel to the right people. It's time now to do that, to change. You can do that tonight. And your heart. Maybe you're examining your heart, and you realize there's some pain in there, and you want to get it out. God is the great physician. And if tonight you're ready to fall into His loving care, let Him take care of all your ailments. He wants you to come while we stand and while we sing.